Fear has always been the oldest tool in politics, but in Trump's hands, it became the central stage. Fear of the foreigner, fear of economic decline, fear of losing one's place in society. These were not just anxieties floating in the background, they were sharpened, named, and directed into political weapons. When people are afraid, they stop asking difficult questions. They don't want nuance, they crave clarity. They don't want complexity, they seek absolutes. And so, a leader who amplifies fear offers something deceptively comforting, the illusion that someone finally understands their anxieties and can point to a clear enemy. Psychologically, fear narrows our vision. Neuroscientists have long observed that when human beings are afraid, their capacity for rational thought diminishes. We become more tribal, more reactive, more suspicious of difference. Trump exploited this instinct brilliantly. He painted immigrants not as individuals but as invaders. He spoke of crime not as a nuanced social problem, but as an ever-present danger just beyond the walls of one's home. He conjured an America perpetually under siege, convincing millions that their very survival depended on aligning with him. It was not politics as dialogue, but politics as defense against an imagined apocalypse. Philosophically, this raises troubling questions. If a society allows fear to dictate its choices, what happens to freedom? Freedom is not only about laws or constitutions, it is also about the inner space of thought, the willingness to imagine alternatives, to engage with those who are different, to embrace uncertainty as a condition of democracy. Fear corrodes that inner freedom. It makes people cling to certainty even when certainty is a lie. It makes them welcome authoritarian promises because the discomfort of ambiguity feels unbearable. In that sense, fear is not just an emotion, it is a philosophical surrender. But there is something more subtle at play. Trump's mastery was not only in creating fear, but in seducing people with it. He offered fear as a kind of belonging. We are under threat, he insisted, and they are responsible. To be afraid together became a form of unity, a shared identity. And once fear became the glue that held people together, it was almost impossible to remove it without unraveling the bond itself. This is why even blatant falsehoods and scandals did not shake his core supporters, because their loyalty was not to policy, but to the community of fear he had cultivated. The real danger of this politics of fear is that it begins to reshape the very architecture of society. Neighbors become suspects. Political opponents become enemies. Citizens begin to live in a permanent state of suspicion, and when suspicion becomes the default lens, trust, the foundation of any democracy, crumbles. We must remember this. Fear is not just a feeling, it is a choice about how to see the world. And if we allow fear to govern us, we hand over our power to those who profit from our darkness. The question we must each confront is simple yet profound. Do we wish to be a society held together by fear, or a society that has the courage to imagine something greater? The promise of the strongman has always been a tempting illusion in history. In times of chaos, people naturally long for someone who radiates certainty, who declares without hesitation that they alone have the answers. Trump embodied this role with uncanny precision. He did not merely present himself as a politician with policies, he fashioned himself as the indispensable figure, the one strong enough to protect the people from the storm he himself described. In his rallies, his speeches, and his posture, the message was always the same: I am strength, I am stability, I am the shield against a collapsing world. Psychologically, the attraction to the strongman archetype reveals something deep about human vulnerability. When individuals feel powerless, uncertain, or unseen, they look outward for figures who seem to possess what they lack. Trump's bravado, his refusal to admit weakness, his constant claims of winning, his disdain for compromise was not simply arrogance, it was a performance of strength that filled a psychological void in many of his followers. By presenting himself as unwavering, he allowed them to momentarily silence their own doubts and insecurities. His certainty became their refuge. But here lies the paradox. What appears to be strength often conceals fragility. The strongman thrives on constant applause, on the unbroken loyalty of those who elevate him. His power is not independent but dependent on the continuous surrender of the people's critical faculties, dependent on their willingness to suspend skepticism and place blind trust in him. Trump's strength, therefore, was never absolute, it was borrowed, sustained only by the emotional investment of those who believed in him. And this is the danger when citizens hand over their judgment to a figure who claims to be infallible. They do not just empower him, they disempower themselves. Philosophically, the myth of the strongman speaks to a deeper crisis of democracy. Democracy, at its core, is built on the idea that no single individual has all the answers, that wisdom emerges from dialogue, debate, and shared responsibility. The strongman rejects this premise. He asserts that truth is whatever he declares it to be, that authority resides not in institutions or laws, but in his person. In this way, the strongman's promise is not only a rejection of democracy, it is a rejection of human freedom itself. It tells people that their role is not to think, to question, or to shape the future, but simply to follow. And yet, there is a seduction in this surrender. To follow a strongman relieves the burden of responsibility. It spares people from the discomfort of uncertainty, from the exhausting task of critical thought, from the anxiety of choice. But that comfort comes at a price: the erosion of individuality, the decay of institutions, the slow suffocation of freedom. This is the hidden cost of the strongman's myth. His strength is not real strength. It is a mirror reflecting the fears and longings of those who place their faith in him. And if we do not learn to see through the mirror, we risk mistaking dependency for leadership, illusion for truth. The true question we must face is this: do we want leaders who feed on our weakness, or leaders who call forth our strength? Division has always been a powerful instrument in the hands of those who seek control, and Trump wielded it with remarkable precision. Instead of aiming to bridge differences, he accentuated them. He understood that unity requires compromise, and compromise dilutes authority. But division creates energy, passion, loyalty. By drawing lines between us and them, he transformed politics into a battlefield where every disagreement became existential. It was not simply about policy, it was about identity, about who belongs and who does not. Psychologically, human beings are wired to categorize. Our ancestors survived by distinguishing friend from foe, ally from rival. In modern societies, that instinct still lingers, but healthy democracies work to temper it. They encourage citizens to see complexity, to acknowledge that people with different backgrounds and beliefs can coexist and even enrich one another. Trump flipped this on its head. He sharpened old divisions, race, class, geography, and gave them new urgency. Immigrants were not merely different, they were dangerous. Journalists were not merely critics, they were enemies. Political opponents were not simply wrong, they were threats to the nation itself. The effect of this constant framing is profound. When groups are pitted against one another, trust dissolves, and without trust, society cannot function. The neighbor becomes suspicious, the colleague becomes adversarial, and the stranger becomes a source of dread. In such an environment, people stop listening and begin defending. They stop seeing opponents as fellow citizens and begin perceiving them as obstacles to be defeated. What emerges is not dialogue but perpetual conflict, a culture of siege where every compromise feels like betrayal. Philosophically, this reveals a dangerous shift. Division as a political strategy strips democracy of its essence. Democracy assumes that despite our differences, there exists a shared commitment to the common good, a belief that disagreement can ultimately strengthen us. But when division becomes the goal, the common good evaporates. Politics turns into a zero-sum game where one side's victory must mean the other's annihilation. This is not just unsustainable, it is corrosive. It erodes the very possibility of a society built on cooperation, empathy, or mutual respect. And yet, there is a seductive simplicity in division. It tells people exactly who they are and who they are not. It offers a sense of belonging by providing a clear enemy. To be united against something is easier than to be united for something. Trump tapped into that simplicity, creating communities not of shared hope, but of shared resentment. It gave people identity, but it also locked them into a cycle of hostility that only deepened the darkness he thrived upon. We must be clear about what this means. When a leader builds power on division, it is not merely politics. It is a dismantling of the human capacity to see one another as equals. And if we accept that dismantling, we will inherit a society where conflict becomes permanent and peace becomes impossible. The challenge before us is to reject the cheap comfort of division and choose instead the harder, braver task of building bridges. For if we cannot see each other as part of the same whole, we will always remain trapped in fragments. Truth is the lifeblood of any democracy. Without some shared sense of reality, people cannot deliberate, cannot compromise, cannot move forward together. Yet under Trump, truth itself became negotiable. He mastered the art of turning facts into weapons, not by disproving them, but by drowning them in suspicion. The phrase, fake news, was not just a slogan, it was a strategy. It gave him the power to dismiss any inconvenient truth, and at the same time it gave his followers permission to believe only what he endorsed. In such a climate, truth was no longer about evidence, it was about allegiance. Psychologically, this kind of manipulation preys on a deep human vulnerability. We do not simply process information like machines, we interpret it through the lens of our fears, desires, and loyalties. When a trusted figure tells us that reality is rigged, we feel less confusion and more control, because suddenly the world makes sense again. Trump exploited this bias relentlessly. By branding mainstream institutions, journalists, scientists, judges, as corrupt or deceptive, he created an alternate reality in which he alone could be trusted. And once that alternate reality took hold, even the most blatant contradictions failed to shake it. This is where the philosophical danger lies. When truth becomes relative, power replaces reason as the foundation of public life. Words stop pointing to reality and begin pointing only to authority. If the leader says the crowd was the largest in history, then it was. If he claims an election was stolen, then it must have been. In such a system, truth is not discovered through dialogue or evidence, it is dictated by proclamation. That is the essence of darkness in politics, not just lying, but reshaping the very conditions under which truth can be recognized. The consequences extend far beyond one leader. A culture in which facts are endlessly manipulated breeds cynicism. People stop asking, what is true? And start asking, whose truth do I choose? Debate becomes futile because each side is working from an entirely different reality. This fragmentation undermines not only trust in leaders, but trust in one another. If I believe the world is collapsing and you believe it is thriving, how can we possibly act together as citizens? And yet, there is also something seductively liberating about this collapse of truth. It frees people from accountability. If reality is fluid, then no action needs to be justified, no mistake needs to be admitted, no responsibility needs to be taken. Trump offered his supporters not just a political platform, but a kind of moral escape, a world where the discomfort of truth could be replaced with the comfort of belief. But here is the cost when we allow truth to be sacrificed. We lose the compass that keeps society from drifting into chaos. A nation without truth is a nation without direction, vulnerable to manipulation, trapped in endless conflict. The challenge, then, is not simply to reject lies, but to reclaim the courage to face reality as it is, however uncomfortable. For only when we honor truth above power can democracy breathe again. And the question we must carry forward is this: are we willing to defend truth, even when it challenges us, or will we allow it to vanish into the shadows? One of the most insidious effects of Trump's rise was not just in policy or rhetoric, but in the slow erosion of moral boundaries. What once would have shocked the conscience of the public began to pass as normal. Words that carried hostility, cruelty, or outright contempt no longer disqualified a leader. They became part of the entertainment, part of the spectacle. When lies were exposed, they were dismissed as exaggerations. When insults were hurled, they were reframed as authenticity. What was once unacceptable was recast as refreshing honesty, as though the breaking of norms itself was a virtue. Psychologically, this reveals a dangerous shift in collective behavior. Human beings adapt quickly to their environment, and what we are repeatedly exposed to becomes normalized. If contempt becomes the daily language of politics, people begin to mirror it in their own conversations. If deception is excused at the highest level, truth becomes negotiable at every level. Over time, the line between right and wrong blurs, not because individuals consciously abandon morality, but because morality itself becomes harder to see. This is how cultures drift, not through sudden collapse, but through the gradual lowering of expectations. Trump's method was to push the boundaries one step at a time. Each insult, each fabrication, each act of defiance against tradition tested the public's tolerance. And when society did not push back, the boundary shifted. What was once unimaginable became ordinary, and the ordinary became invisible. This incremental erosion is more dangerous than outright destruction because it disguises itself as harmless. People tell themselves, it's only words, it's only rhetoric, it's only temporary. But in the process, they are recalibrating their sense of what leadership, truth, and decency look like. Philosophically, the collapse of moral boundaries raises a profound question: can a society survive if it no longer agrees on basic standards of conduct? Democracy depends not only on laws but on unwritten norms, respect for institutions, civility in discourse, restraint in the use of power. When those norms are shredded, the law itself becomes fragile because laws are upheld not just by courts but by a culture that values them. Once moral boundaries dissolve, rules alone cannot hold society together. And yet, there is a seductive quality to this collapse. It gives people permission to release their own frustrations without guilt. If the leader mocks, why can't I? If the leader lies, why should I bother with honesty? Trump did not merely lead politically, he gave cultural permission to abandon restraint, to indulge in impulses once kept in check. The danger here is not just what he modeled, but what it awakened in those who followed him. This is the true cost of the politics of darkness. It teaches us to accept less of ourselves, to lower the bar for what we demand from leaders and from one another. If we allow moral boundaries to collapse, we do not just lose trust in government, we lose faith in the possibility of decency itself. And so the challenge falls to us: Will we accept a society where cruelty and deception are normalized, or will we insist on holding the line even when it costs us comfort? For in the end, the standards we tolerate will become the standards we live by. The politics of darkness does not simply vanish when the headlines fade or when leaders leave office. It leaves behind a residue, a hidden cost that lingers in the collective psyche and in the fabric of society. Trump's era was not only about policy shifts or electoral battles, it was about reshaping how people saw one another, how they spoke to one another, and even how they imagined the future. The rhetoric of fear, division, and suspicion seeped into daily life. Families were torn apart at dinner tables, friendships dissolved over arguments, communities fractured along invisible lines. This is the unseen toll, a culture of mistrust that outlives any single politician. Psychologically, the effects are profound. When people live under constant fear or anger, it changes them. Neuroscience tells us that prolonged exposure to anxiety rewires the brain, narrowing attention, heightening defensiveness, and suppressing empathy. Trump's politics fed that cycle, encouraging people to view the world not as a place of possibility, but as a battlefield of threats. Over time, such a mindset breeds cynicism. People stop believing in dialogue, stop trusting in institutions, and eventually stop imagining that progress is even possible. The result is a society paralyzed by suspicion, where every gesture is interpreted through the lens of hostility. Philosophically, this erosion points to something deeper: the collapse of shared meaning. Democracy is not sustained merely by laws or elections, it depends on an invisible social contract. A willingness to believe that despite our differences, we are bound by a common fate. The politics of darkness undermines that contract. It teaches people to see neighbors as strangers and strangers as enemies. And when that shift becomes normalized, the possibility of collective action, of building towards something greater, begins to dissolve. The hidden cost also reveals itself in the exhaustion of spirit. When people are constantly told that the world is collapsing, that enemies lurk everywhere, that betrayal is inevitable, hope becomes fragile. And without hope, societies retreat into survival mode. They become reactive rather than creative, defensive rather than visionary. Trump's shadow was not only in the fear he amplified, but in the hope he withered. And yet, even in this darkness, there lies a choice. The residue of mistrust need not be permanent. History shows us that societies can recover, but only when citizens refuse to surrender to despair. The antidote to the politics of darkness is not naive optimism, but courage, the courage to rebuild trust, to defend truth, to restore moral boundaries, and to imagine unity where division has been sown. The real question before us is not whether Trump will return, but whether we have learned what his rise has revealed about ourselves. For the politics of darkness thrives only when people surrender their light. And so the challenge is deeply personal. Will we allow fear and suspicion to define us, or will we reclaim the courage to see one another not as enemies, but as partners in a shared destiny? The answer to that question will determine not only the future of democracy, but the future of our humanity.